everybody, and welcome to a very special spoilercast edition of GameSpot Gameplay. I'm your host, Kevin Van Ord, and joining me in the studio are the very fine Tom McShay.
Hello, Kevin.
And Giant Bomb's Jeff Gershman.
Not very fine. Not in a Tom McShay sort of way.
Yeah, but you'll do.
I'll hey.
And more importantly, joining us via phone is the lead writer of Spec Ops: The Line, Walt Williams. How you doing, Walt?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you guys?
Really great.
Good.
We're really happy to have you on board and talk about Spec Ops. And I guess I should mention that this is a spoiler cast. So the things we will be talking about will spoil the game for you. So
yes.
if you haven't finished Spec Ops or, and plan to, this probably isn't the podcast for you. But if you have finished or just want to listen in on, the things that make Spec Ops what it is, then by all means, continue to let the podcast play. So Walt, we have tons of questions for you, in particular because Spec Ops is still fresh on my mind since I was just playing it literally 15 minutes ago. And I wanted to sort of start with the idea from the very beginning. Is how does the idea of a shooter based on Heart of Darkness come about? Is it like, hey, we want to make a shooter. What shooter should it be? Or do you come up with the idea of the inspiration and then determine how to develop around it? Or what was the sort of the process at that stage?
Well, it was a mixture of both. We knew right off the bat that we were going to make a third-person squad-based military shooter set in Dubai. That was the box that we were given to work with inside. And so as we were looking at that and trying to figure out really what it is that we wanted to do within that box, within that world and the genre itself, you begin looking at other bits of artistic inspiration, things that you enjoy, things that have inspired you. And one of the things that came up looking through that was the film Apocalypse Now. Now, obviously, the game is not a Vietnam game, and we didn't want to be going in and directly, making an adaptation of Apocalypse Now. So the idea went to go back and look at the original source material that film was inspired by, which is where Heart of Darkness as an inspiration came up. And reading through that and seeing from a kind of a narrative structure, it looks very strongly inspired by Heart of Darkness, but really what Heart of Darkness inspired most was more about kind of the peeling back of layers of a character, where you have this character that Conrad that is held up to this very high regard. And then as you get further and further closer to him in Dubai, you begin to see how all of that has cracked under the weight of the situations, much like Kurtz in Heart of Darkness. A little bit, much less than Apocalypse Now. In Apocalypse Now, at the beginning, they already know that Kurtz is insane, and it's simply a mission to go and kill him. Whereas in Heart of Darkness, they are simply trying to find what has happened to this man who is in very high regard. And then with the main character of Walker, really turning it into a similar situation with him, where you're peeling back the layers on him and his squad mates and seeing really just kind of what happens to all these people when they're put into a situation where no matter what they do, it continues to become worse around them, no matter how hard they try to make it better. So in that regard, that's really where Heart of Darkness became the biggest inspiration for the story that we wanted to tell. It wasn't that we set out to necessarily say, okay, we want to make the Apocalypse Now of video games, although that's, certainly not a bad goal to have. We just felt that where military shooters had been prior to Spec Ops, they had not gotten very personal into the hearts and the minds of the people going through the conflicts. And that's what that was the story that we wanted to tell. And Heart of Darkness was a good inspirational jumping off point for that.
Yeah, and some of us, at least some of us in this room, definitely got involved in that personal story. It's sort of interesting the number of takes that various people in the offices have had to Spec Ops and the way it tells its story. Tom, what was your how did you feel playing the game, and what was your sort of takeaway ultimately?
I felt sick playing the game. I didn't realize what it was trying to accomplish at certain points. So when you're in the helicopter and you're shooting the radio tower, I thought that was just feeding into the let's blow stuff up because it's fun war mentality of video games. I guess I wanted to ask you, like, the gameplay is standard, and I have theories about why the gameplay is standard compared to other shooters. It's very similar. I guess as the writer, I was kind of wondering what your thoughts are about how your story meshes with the action.
Well, I mean, the gameplay being standard, I think there's something to that. When you're trying to do something that's different in the narrative landscape, particularly in a very well-established genre, you want to be able to attract as many players as possible. You don't want to give them something that is so completely alien from what they've experienced before, that to the point that they will be completely turned off by the experience and not want to experience it at all. I mean, there was certainly, at the beginning of the game in particular, like the characters, even in a narrative sense, are acting in a way that's meant to be familiar. We wanted to lure people into a sense of familiarity, both with controls, characters, set up certain personality archetypes, and then narratively really have all of that begin to shift and change and crack so that they see this arc and they go through this arc with the characters. In regards to how the two gel, I mean, there's a question that comes up, which is, can a military shooter, or can a video game, a shooter in general, have something to say about shooting or about the horrors of war when the player is forced to, kill thousands of people? And I think the answer is that's the only way that a game can say something about the horrors of war, because the game isn't about the horrors that other people are perpetuating, although, yes, that is happening. It's about the horrors that you personally, as the gamer and as Captain Walker, are committing. And by by throwing that action, having the player become more extreme and become more drastic and become just a more vicious, violent person, that's expressing these horrors of war through who you are. And rather than, it's not a voyeuristic medium. The player has seen horrible things before. And not just in this game, but in every other game. We've seen horrible things in front of us, and they're meant to shock us. And at this point, they don't. We've seen so many things. We've become so trained to expect to be shocked. But to have the player now become completely the cause of these horrible things, and to continue to go down that journey and see where it takes them, or if not, to put down the controller and stop playing the game, which I consider to be a very valid reaction to the things that happened in Spec Ops. That's what we wanted to put the player through.
Did you do that, Tom? Right? Did you set the control? Did you set the controller down at that point?
It was after you destroy the radio tower that I put it down. I didn't realize at that point what the game was trying to accomplish, and that it was trying to paint a picture that you're essentially the bad guy, and that these horrors are disgusting. They're not supposed to be fun. But I didn't realize at that point. Now I appreciate going back. I guess one question I had was, the game uses tropes like regenerating health and turret sequences and killing thousands of enemies. And at the end of the game, you find out, like, oh, you have a hero complex. Was that like an intentional thing to tie in this hero complex one-man army mentality with the story? Was it just how that turned out because you wanted to make it familiar?
No, that was absolutely intentional. I mean, you'll hear lines as you get further into the game coming from the enemies that you're fighting, where they are no longer as aggressive and taunting. Now they have become frightened of you. You are something that should not be possible. You're a three-man squad that has managed to take out the majority of their numbers. They are genuinely frightened of you. You are a real threat, and they don't understand how you are one. It's, with video games, you have certain video game tropes that you have to work with. And, from the narrative side, we did our absolute best to integrate them into the tone that you were getting, feeding back from both the world, from the enemies, from your characters, from your squad mates. We wanted this one-man army hero thing. This was really the crux of the entire story, because while it is a war story in the sense that you're a soldier fighting soldiers in a combat situation, ultimately it's really meant to be a story about who you are as the gamer playing this game. Like, you put the controller down, you chose to walk out of Dubai, which Walker could have done. He could have stopped at any time. And we wanted the real choice of the game to not, be a choice that you were making as Walker, but to be a choice that you were making as the gamer playing a game, which is to continue down the same road that this character is continuing down. The fact that you chose to put down the control, I actually think, is a very strong decision on your part, because you reached a point where in this game and in the mission, if you were Walker, you had crossed a line. I hate saying that in regards to this game because of the title, but you had gone too far, and you didn't want to go any further because you had reached that limit of yourself.
Now, a lot of the stuff you're talking about is stuff that pays off fairly late in the game. The story really is kind of a slow burn on a lot of that. So I think I played through the first half just going like, why, what's even, this is just, it's just boring. So I wonder, like, was that a point of debate? There are a lot of games that try to front load something for the player so that right out of the gate they're doing something going like, oh, I made the right move buying this game. It's so awesome. So I just wonder, was there a lot of debate internally over the story and the pacing of the story?
There was. I mean, ultimately we decided to stick with the way that the game had been designed, which was we wanted it to be more like a snowball rolling down a hill. I think the statistic is something like 40% of gamers actually complete games that they start.
Right.
And I think that probably, I know at least for me, has to deal with that. So much of the wow factor tends to be up front, and then when you get into the long haul of the game, it becomes very repetitive, and now you have experienced everything it has to offer, and you kind of have to get through sometimes this long middle valley to get to the climax of the situation. I know for me personally, that's why I end up putting down a game, and a lot of times the ending doesn't necessarily, blow you out of the water. It's just an ending, and going way back to when I was a kid here, the thing for me with games that was always the biggest deal was when you completed a game, getting that ending was such a reward. It was a real, hey, okay, I feel like I have accomplished something by beating this. And then, jumping forward, you get games now that have very well put together endings. I remember the Dragon Age, the first Dragon Age game, Origins. When I had beaten that game, the ending that I'd gotten, and even though it was just kind of a text screen explaining everything, I really felt like this was the only ending that I could have gotten in the game that I had played. Everything felt right. It didn't feel like it had just jumbled together my answers and threw it up on the screen. And that was one of the things that we really wanted to do with Spec Ops, is that since this was such a dark narrative, that it was going to be asking a lot of players as they got into it that at the end they needed to at least feel some closure. They needed to feel some payoff to everything that they had gone through, some climactic moment. In many ways, the story is a lot like pulling a rubber band, and you get further and further, and you keep pulling and pulling and pulling and pulling, waiting for it to snap, and that tension has to be released, and that's what the ending was. We had to release all of the tension that the player had built to and give them some form of resolution, even if that resolution was just the rubber band snapping and popping them in the eye.
One of the things that's interesting for me about this is this game to me was a critique of military games and just the way war is portrayed in general in the media. And like, people are going to pick it up thinking it's a war game like Call of Duty, where it's just supposed to be fun, and it kind of insults that mentality. And I wonder how you think people, the general military crowd would react to this, because it seems like you're really walking a fine line, because you don't want to insult them, but you have this strong message that you want to say. So I was just wondering what you thought.
Well, I mean, I think gamers are smarter than that. I don't think gamers are simply walking in to pick up a game strictly for, pure entertainment face value and nothing else. This discussion comes up a lot, and we had the discussion a lot during production. Do people want to play a shooter that makes them feel bad about shooting people? And it's a fair question, but I mean, when you look at every other form of art out there, having the art speak about itself, especially a well-versed genre that is very well known, people are attracted to this, and we like to feel other feelings through our art rather than just, a pure sense of entertainment. When you call a game fun, I think you're looking at a game strictly as a toy. And if we're going to look at games as art, we have to stop using the word fun. We have to think about the word engaging. The opposite of fun in a game is really, it's not unfun, it's broken. a game stops being fun when it doesn't work. And when you're looking to tell a more mature narrative, you simply have to have the gameplay doesn't need to be giving you a sense of, wow, so much fun, exciting. It needs to be giving you a sense of engaging, that it's pulling you further in with the gameplay. If the gameplay in Spec Ops had been broken, doesn't matter how how much of a draw the narrative was, people wouldn't have made it to the end because the gameplay would not have allowed them to do so. It would have been too frustrating. So you have to balance that dark narrative with simply making a game that is engaging.
I mean, it crossed my mind while I was playing because a lot of my favorite storytelling came in the intelligence, and you know, I've gotten so used over time. Like, very few games that have those kinds of collectibles I give two shits about when I'm playing the game. Like, you go and pick it up, but there gets a point where it's just scattered everywhere and you don't care about it anymore. And BioShock is one of those games that actually used that to some effect. And I think Spec Ops, for me, is actually another. And part of that was because it's not scattered everywhere. You know, there are very limited pieces of intelligence to pick up. And when you pick it up, it actually has something to say. Was like limiting the intelligence to find a purposeful decision rather than just scattering little pieces of story all over the place?
Absolutely. Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know that it didn't just start off with the idea of let's do less intel. We just went about looking at, okay, what are the bits and pieces of information that we still want to tell in the story? What's left that we feel people need or would want to know a bit more? And we worked really hard in already putting out most of the information that we want people to get in the story. And through generic lines and environmental storytelling and things like that. We had already worked very hard in getting a lot of that information in there. So when it got time to do the intel, there wasn't too much that was left as far as like backstory things that we needed to get across. The main thing with the intel that we really wanted to do was really have it be a window into Walker, which is why you have, because he's very stoic and he's not as open as you would think or you would expect from a leading character, particularly where you have very talkative squad mates. He doesn't always interact with that back and forth that Lugo and Adams have. And so we wanted to give kind of a window into what he was thinking, and that's where we decided to do half of the intels as being these Walker monologues where you pick up an item and it's more about him in that moment reacting to what he has found inside his head and what he's thinking about those things. I think there's maybe at the end of the day, maybe 20, 21, 28. I think it's a 2 at the beginning, but somewhere in the 20s of the number of intel.
It's definitely not a lot. I mean, it's like just 2 a level or maybe 1 a level.
Yeah,
like that.
Yeah, it's not many, and I know that there were even a handful more that we had written that we didn't put in because we ultimately decided they just weren't necessary. And that, when that was something we were trying really hard to do with this game, is that if it wasn't necessary in the single player campaign, keep it out. If it wasn't if it didn't feel like it was organically coming out of the story or backing up the story, if it felt simply exploitive, then take it out. Which I think, overall, I think we achieved that.
When you talked too before about, well, Tom brought this up about how he just felt terrible during one sequence, and I think probably a lot of people will react the same way to the phosphorus bit on the battlefield. 8. Yeah, and that was the point for me where I had to stop playing for the night because I felt truly terrible. And there was this moment too where, I mean, it's interesting the situations that the game put me in terms of what I can react to, and then how the game responds to me. And I'm not just talking about like the places where you're specifically supposed to make a choice, but like walking through the phosphorus battlefield, I ended up shooting a guy because part of my thought process was this guy is miserable, and I want to bring that to a close. And then Walker has this line when I do that saying, well, what? He was going to die anyway. And I was sort of, that was the point where I was like, I got to stop playing this right now because I feel terrible. And, how conscious were you of, I mean, obviously you sort of wanted people to feel awful, but did you worry that people were going to turn the game off and then not turn it back on? And more interestingly, I think a lot of those moments are the things, they take the shooter tropes, like Tom was saying, and turn them on their head, like the big turret sequence and the big moment where you get to drop bombs on a battlefield. In Call of Duty, that's like the ultimate power fantasy moment where you just exert incredible amounts of control over a battlefield, where it's almost the opposite in Spec Ops, where this is the moment where I feel the absolute worst up to this point. And
it's just, wow, this is really fucked.
Yeah, exactly.
We did that entirely by design because of how that mode in Call of Duty makes you feel. It's the point where in combat you cease to see your enemy as a person. You turn them into nothing but a white dot, and you turn yourself into this all-powerful being simply raining down destruction on them. It's the point where you stop thinking about your enemy as human, and then you see the consequence of what happens when you do that. We have this. If there was one specific moment in the game that was designed to make you feel bad, because I wouldn't say that the entire game was designed to make you feel bad. We didn't just want people to walk away and feel depressed or sick. We wanted everyone for the whole game to have their own feeling at the end. But yes, this moment in particular was designed to completely hit you off guard and to make you feel very sick about what you have done, because that is the only moment in the game where you change the way you're looking at the battlefield. You're no longer looking at it through the eyes of Walker. You're looking at it through this camera, and you're turning it into, the most game-like view that you possibly could have within the game.
So I ended up actually having like a pretty strong disconnect with the game at that point, where, there had been choices you could make up to that point. Where they were very clearly like, this is a moment where I'm going to make a choice and then an achievement will ring up one way or the other. So when you get to that scene and you've got, kind of one squad mate saying, yeah, let's do this, and the other one saying, let's not do this, like that seemed like a moment where you could make a choice. So I actually spent a good chunk of time just trying to engage the enemy with my standard weapons, and then had, basically all the snipers show up and you kind of, it seems like the game is very much telling you, like, no, this is not you do not have a choice here. And then later on in that sequence, kind of after you have cleared out most of the actual combatants, it's fairly obvious looking through that scope or looking through that camera lens that the people trapped in the pen in the back are not soldiers.
Right.
And I kept like trying to hit the B button going like, okay, I think we're done here. I can just clean up the rest of these guys with my conventional weapons and not kill who are obviously these civilians at the back of this area. I mean, there are choices throughout other parts of the game. I mean, it feels like this one was like a huge parts of the story hinge on you having done this. But was there ever a time where there were more decision points in the story?
Well, I mean, it's still in some ways a choice, and it's not the kind of choice that people like to get in a video game, though. Admittedly, and I'll get into a second. I think there's one mistake we made in the setting up of the choice, but I'll get to that in a second. Like you said, you attempted to engage the soldiers simply using your weapons, and you could have, but you are outnumbered. You have a limited amount of ammunition. There's no way that you would be able to take out all of those people with the guns that you had if you went straight into fighting them. The mistake that we made was not having an exit for you to go down and attempt to fight them up front, which had been there, and I believe, in an earlier iteration, and I'm not entirely certain if we took it out for a tech issue or not, because that was a while ago, but it may have been an issue with memory of streaming in two different versions of the map down there for the player to move through.
Right.
But I'm not saying that as an excuse, because I may be totally wrong in remembering it that way. But there's an idea behind player agency that we wanted to get around in Spec Ops, and that idea is that if I choose to do something this way, I should be able to be victorious because this is the way I want to do it. And that's not the way the world works.
Sure.
There are quite a few things that I want to accomplish, and simply because I choose to do so does not mean that is going to happen. You have the ability to open fire with your weapons, and you can kill as many of them as you can with the ammo that you have around you. inevitably you will be overrun because you do not have enough. And that weapon, the only other weapon you have at your disposal, is that mortar. So, in that regard, we wanted there is still a choice to it. It's just not a choice that you can get out of the situation by going both ways. Mm-hmm. And, that's not something we like to hear when we play a video game. We like to know that the world is going to bend entirely to our will, and that every situation revolves around us and the actions that we make. Now, in regards to what you were saying towards the end, if I can ask back in return, like when you were seeing the people moving in the trench,
mm-hmm.
How much did you know about the scene prior to that?
Nothing really.
Nothing. Okay. What was it about you that made you think that they were people?
I mean, they are all standing very tightly packed together in a way that soldiers wouldn't, and they're not moving around.
That's fair. That's fair.
They're not taking up positions to fire on you. They're just kind of in this trench. Like it's pretty clear that they are not the enemy.
And so that's something I missed.
Yeah, no, I mean you're absolutely more observant than a lot of the people in focus testing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There was something designed in that scene in particular. Is right before that is you begin to get word from your squad that soldiers are retreating, and depending on how many you had killed prior to that point, you actually see these soldiers begin to run back to the trench and jump down into it, and you're following those dots up to the trench. That I think it is possible for that to be missed if you're already looking at other areas or you've killed the soldiers that have run. But no, there is, I think, in that moment of choice, it would have been nice to have had you be able to pull out of that because you were seeing something that Walker himself was not seeing. But ultimately, for the broader scope of the story, we had to create a moment that went against the player's expectations. There was a point where we were actually discussing having it branch here and having the story go in two different directions, all the way up to the end, and then have two very, very different endings. But ultimately, the ending, but looking at it that way, it felt it was going to be very, very hard to do that, especially with the ending that you have right now, and now we're really going into spoilers, so if you haven't finished the game,
sure.
With Conrad being dead, you end up with a very different game. You have the question of, well, so is Conrad just not present in the game at all if you don't kill these civilians? Or I think someone even suggested at one point, well, Conrad's still in the game, but when you get to the end, he's actually alive. So you weren't crazy. You were talking to him because you didn't do this thing that kind of broke you. But, it really, then you have people making a choice that is creating a story that they are in no way really controlling, Conrad being alive or being dead or being there or not there. That then breaks the ultimate path that we were looking to put the player down.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely key that you have to, for the story that you're trying to tell, like that scene has to play out. I think it's more that it feels like a segment, because there are other portions of the game where you are making a very clear choice, and it's usually pretty obvious when those moments are. And at the beginning of that moment, at the beginning of that sequence, it feels like one of those moments, only there really is no second valid choice.
No, and that's fair. And with the line that Walker says, he responds to Lugo. Lugo says, "There's always a choice," and Walker responds, "No, there isn't."
I wonder, was that added late to kind of drive home to the player, like, no, dude, get on the mortar, like this is it.
It was, and it was also kind of looking back at the previous choice as well, where you're attempting to save Lieutenant Gould or Agent Gould, and you can't. He's going to die no matter what. The only choice you actually have of people you can save are the civilians. And it was kind of looking back on that as well, that saying that simply because you want something to happen one way doesn't mean it's going to. You may feel like you have the choice to save him, but saving him it's not entirely up to you. There are other factors happening in that situation. This guy's, more likely was already on the edge of death when you arrived on the scene. He was going to die one way or the other.
Right.
It's not information that you knew. but you still thought, I have the choice to save him, but you didn't. The only choice you had was whether or not to save the civilian. So it was kind of, it was doing, double duty there. It was looking back at the Gould choice and looking at it in a different light, and then looking to the choice in front of you, or the scene in front of you.
Right. I feel like the difference is that in that case, the game carries forward either way.
Yeah.
Whereas in the other one, it's very much like restart checkpoint. Like, okay, this actually isn't a choice. So.
Well, that actually reminds me too. There's a line of dialogue at one point where is it Adams maybe says to Walker, "There's always a choice," and then he responds, "No, there's really not."
Yeah.
And it's interesting because that comes somewhat after that moment with Gould, and when I got to that moment, what I ended up choosing to do was save Gould at the expense of the civilians, and then I was like ultimately crushed a few moments later when he dies anyway, and I felt really awful about what to me seemed like the futility of losing those lives. But I was wondering about that line in particular, whether there's always a choice and there's really not. Is how meta was that particular line? Because sometimes it reminds me of moments like Jeff is talking about when it's like there's, where you think maybe there's a choice, but there's really not. And I was just kind of wondering how much we could actually read into that line and how much of it was looking at itself.
It's certainly meta, but I mean also it was kind of meant to reflect on just the nature of normal life. I mean, we've talked a bit about choices in games versus the way the real world works earlier. That simply because you feel like you have a choice doesn't mean, or even it may appear to you like you have one, doesn't mean that either of these options that you see are going to play out as options. Life is very rarely a binary choose A or choose B, and both of these will lead to a situation unless you're talking about what you're going to eat for lunch. It was really more just kind of looking at trying to bring up this thought of how choices tend to work in the real world and relating it back to the choices that you're having in the game. And one of the things that we wanted to do with these choices, and the Gould one is an excellent example of that, is playing with the player's expectations versus the reality of the situation. The player doesn't always have all the information when they're going into a choice that they would need to make a fully educated decision. And only at the end of the choice, after they've made a decision and they see how everything else has played out, do they see that, this was not exactly what they thought it was. And maybe they still made the right decision, maybe they made the wrong decision. Either way, the story continues to move forward. It was, that's really, in a lot of ways, it's where the subtitle of the game comes in, is the line. A lot of people think it deals with like the crossing of a line metaphor, but really it was more about the line between expectations and reality, and having the world react in a way that was not simply a reaction to the player, but that other characters and scenes would have, their own motivations, their own way that they would react, and having that carry over to things that had maybe happened in the scene before the player had shown up. For instance, them showing up to save Gould, not knowing that Gould is mortally wounded already.
Now, Jeff brought up the disconnect he sort of had with the phosphorus thing, and I'm kind of sad, actually, that our reviewer of the game, Chris Waters, isn't here to also discuss, because he had many moments of that sort of disconnect between the message and the actual gameplay, but I wanted to bring up something that I actually felt sort of hit that disconnect as well, which is, you get the option to execute dudes, who haven't quite yet kick the bucket. You can just run up to them and smash them with your foot, for example. And that, for me, that ran very contrary to what the message of the game was at that point, or who these people, who these characters actually were. Was there any discussion about the kind of shooter tropes that had to be there and the kind that might have clashed with the storytelling?
Well, I mean, it really ends up being about the player. I mean, when you look at the executions, the executions that you see at the beginning of the game and the ones that you see at the end of the game are very different from each other. At the beginning, they're fast, they are quick, they are, one-blow kills for the most part, whereas at the end they become bit more drawn out, a bit unnecessarily cruel, much more brutal. And, this is an evolution of, Walker's reaction to the situation where he is becoming more brutal and more angry and more vindictive to what's happening around him. But in a lot of cases, and, we found this when we were focus testing, which is one of the reasons that we actually decided to keep it in, because the question that you brought up did come up. But we found a lot of people in focus testing, they would do an execution early in the game, and they would say, oh, that's not really what I was going for. And they would not execute anymore. They would simply, shoot a man in the head as he was moaning on the ground and take his weapon. They wouldn't take part in that. And, there's a certain that, we were looking to give the player a few different options of how they wanted to interact with these characters in these moments, which is why execution is, was never something that you had to do.
Right. I wanted to go back to something you talked about earlier. You talked about humanizing enemies. And that's one of my biggest problems with military games is it's like Hogan's Alley. Like they don't like build up so you empathize at all. And you did a good job towards the end of like fleshing out who these people were you were fighting. But at the same time, it's Americans, and I think that we're prone to want to understand Americans more. Like, where do you? Because most military games, you're fighting Russia or Korea or someone else, and it's like, what? How do you go about making your enemies someone you can sympathize with and understand that they are also just human beings doing their job? And like, how difficult a task is this?
Well, I mean, it didn't feel terribly difficult when we were working on it. I mean, the first time that you come across two soldiers just having a conversation, or two lookouts as you're descending into the gorge, and there's, these are two guys taking a break, sharing a stick of gum, looking out at a row of skyscrapers buried under sand, and, taking a breather in a moment to kind of notice how weird it is, how beautiful the place can be when you just have a moment of peace to step back and look at it. In a second, these guys are going to come off their break, they're going to turn around their seat, and they're going to open fire. You could wait for that moment to happen and respond in a way to, secure your survival, or you could take advantage of the situation and you can kill them before they even know that they're in a fight. It's having enemies not talk like enemies, but having them talk like people in a lot of ways. There's an Intel pickup that is a recording from a man who became an interrogator in the 33rd, where it explains that to be an interrogator for the 33rd, anyone who wanted to be an interrogator had to undergo every mode of torture that they were approved to use on a prisoner. They had to understand what they were making someone go through. They were trying their absolute best to not simply become monsters. Even though they were doing horrible things, they were trying to create some level of empathy towards the situation in hopes of holding on to whatever bit of humanity they still felt that they had. And this revelation from this interrogator, this diary that he's left behind, is, it changes the way he thinks suddenly about the people that are going through this situation, and he understands what it feels like and how willing he would have been to give up everything that he knew had he been put under this situation. And you have to write you have to write enemies in many ways as the player, I think, is the way to do it. And when when you get them in the studio, when you get an actor doing that voice, you have to direct them in such a way as to, don't just sound like you're a bad guy with a gun. Read these lines like you are the main character of this game that the player is playing. And, that's another way. You have to factor in simply how an actor's performance is going to bring that character to life.
So why do you think other military games either don't try or are so bad at making your enemies people? And like they're just terrorists almost all the time with, mindless monsters. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's an easy enemy. It's when you look at, say, like World War II as a military genre, you have an enemy right there that is the perfect enemy. You have simply the Nazis. No one can argue that is the perfect enemy to throw up, and you just have to kill them all. I don't know that I can't, certainly speak to the design of every other military game that's been made in the past few years, but I think, in a lot of ways they probably aren't trying to make them feel like that they are people. They are trying to make them feel as if they are they are a large obstacle for your character to overcome. The world is in danger. It is in danger from evil men. You have to be the better man to overcome that. I think, for what they're striving to do with their games, they are creating their enemies perfect.
And that's the same tactic that a lot of films take too. It's just kind of creating this faceless enemy, like the propaganda machine angle of how war is presented in society.
No, absolutely. But, at the same time, not all movies present war that way.
Yeah.
And we really felt going into Spec Ops that for video games, we were presenting war only one way. And that was a very big driving force of kind of opening that view up to a broader view that other mediums had long ago accepted.
Why is that, do you think? Why do war games in particular, why did the developers, either it's the developers that aren't striving to say anything more than has already been said countless times over the last decade, or is it more because at this stage, games, are so marketing driven and so publisher driven to get that buck and to try to copy Call of Duty level success that nobody even cares about a message?
Well, I don't know. Call of Duty, obviously, they have a thing that they do, and people expect a certain thing from a Call of Duty game. A Call of Duty game, yes, it's war, but really Call of Duty is about a very visceral, almost Michael Bay level experience of just being constantly bombarded by stimuli from every possible angle. Yes, it becomes a war game because you're playing a soldier in a war, but really the calling card of that series at this point is how big of a spectacle can they give you as in this soldier kind of situation. You take Battlefield, obviously that's a game with a much, built around broader, bigger multiplayer modes where you have all these different, I don't even know the exact number of how many people can join a Battlefield map. You guys would know that better than me. Being able to get planes and tanks and all these things. I think it's that up to this point, military games are built more around the gameplay experience, and we specifically, made the choice to build ours more around the narrative experience. That's not to say that there's anything wrong with the games simply built around, the experience that is gameplay. There's nothing wrong with that. The idea for Spec Ops was not to make a Call of Duty killer or a Medal of Honor killer. It was to make a new entry in the genre, something that could stand next to all of them. If I want to, play Modern Warfare, that option is out there for me already. If I want to play a narrative, darker, more character-driven military game, that option was not there. And we wanted to put it out there. We're still a growing medium. We still have, all of the military genre games that are out there are established franchises, continuing to do what their franchises were doing all the way back to when they were started.
Do you think that, or do you at least hope that maybe you'll spark something different than what was there before, that maybe you'll be an inspiration?
Well, I would certainly say that we hope to be an inspiration in games going forward. Again, I don't think there's anything wrong with Call of Duty doing what they do.
Yeah, I think actually, totally. I think if Call of Duty was to suddenly become this type of game and turn it on its head like that, I just think that abrupt change would be detrimental from every angle. No, totally.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's no problem with having
that there's an audience for this kind of game.
Totally,
and that they will other developers will attempt to follow suit with. Particularly, what makes me excited is the idea of them doing so in other genres.
Yeah.
Not simply the shooter genre. Because I think gaming, more than really any other medium, at least at this point, we are very much building off the shoulders of each other. Spec Ops couldn't exist without all of the other military games that have already come before it. We're all constantly learning from each other and moving the genre forward together. And so, absolutely, we hope that people are inspired with Spec Ops to try different things with their narrative and to, maybe subvert a lot of the things that we've been trained to accept as gamers.
I think that the one thing that I expect that we'll see in games after Spec Ops is you'll start to see more games doing that kind of reactive dialogue thing where, even the the voice cues when you're reloading and things like that change over the course of the game.
Right.
Like that for me was a moment of just like, man, why? How come that hasn't happened before? Like, how has it taken us this long to get to that point? It was
Thank you. It's funny you say that because we actually had that exact same moment in production. Where we were talking about, okay, we want to make this, we want to do this thing where like the generic lines and everything really evolve with the narrative and the characters and everything. And someone goes, has anyone else done that? Is there anything that we can look at to see if it works? And everyone's like, no, I can't think of why hasn't anyone done this yet. This seems pretty obvious. Well, okay, well, we'll just run with it and see how it works. And it ended up, yeah, I mean, it really worked very well in kind of having the world feel like it was changing based off of your actions.
Well, and that's part of the character development too. I mean, I was remarking to Tom just earlier, it's not just about the fact that the lines are changing in and of itself, or that, because squad mates they'll mention very specific things about where I should be aiming and things like that to stand out. But it's also part of Walker's character arc where he starts off just, with the very generic sort of call outs. And then by the end, he's pretty rough about the kind of joy he's taking in mowing these guys down.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, this is one of the things that we found that worked really well to our advantage of doing it third person, is that we felt it would have been harder to have Walker's lines really evolve in this way if it had been a first person game, because you would have had a disconnect between Walker at that point, because you're not seeing Walker as a character. You're simply seeing through his eyes. You're embodying him more and projecting yourself more into him. Whereas having him be third person and at the beginning be a bit more stoic and a bit more generic, that allowed the player to begin by projecting himself onto Walker. But then as Walker was having more reactions to the world and his physical body was changing and how it became more gruff and more broken down, Walker is now also projecting himself back onto the player, because you're seeing him as a separate character every time that you're playing him. You're never going into his eyes, really, with the one exception being when you go to the phosphorus scene, and then you start viewing the world through that camera as a game, and rather than seeing yourself reflected back in your own TV screen, you're seeing Walker reflected back in the screen of that computer, which again, this projecting on, projecting back kind of a thing that we were able to do with it being third person.
So the first scene in the game, you're in a helicopter and you're shooting helicopters, and then it goes back in time, and then you go back to that scene, and he's like, "Oh, this again." I know Brendan Sinclair, he's one of our coworkers, thought it was like a Groundhog Day thing. I just wanted, can you talk about like what that technique was for, why you put that in there?
Yes, there are a few different ways that you can interpret the game as a whole, and we wanted the game to, if you simply just played through it and didn't think anything beyond what you were experiencing on the top, we wanted it to work strictly as a military game, and that you could assume that everything is just happening in real time, with that one moment of deja vu. At that point, Walker had already begun to hallucinate a few things. This was a man who was breaking down and, was having moments of, dislocation from reality. There is another way, and there are quite a few things at the beginning of the game that people haven't picked up on. Walker is actually hallucinating all the way back to the first mission of the game. And that's because you can read the game that in the opening helicopter sequence, it is the only part of the game where Walker is alive. And when the helicopter crashes, from that point on, Walker is dead, and he is reliving everything that had happened up to that point, and is creating his own hell around him, punishing himself over and over for what he has done in that world. And that's where that line comes in the second time, where he begins to kind of wake up to this fact and realize that maybe everything is not as it seems.
Huh. We're looking at each other like,
heavy.
Really? That's definitely something that hadn't crossed my mind.
Yeah, go back to chapter 1 and chapter 5, and you'll actually find Conrad's face in the advertisement in billboards.
Oh.
Oh, wow.
Huh.
What do you know?
I didn't. I thought more people would pick up on it, but no one has actually picked up it on this point. So it might have been a bit too subtle. But that is actually why he said that.
That's really interesting. So Brendan was kind of close with the Groundhog Day, kind of.
He was a little close. And there's another thing going. Since we're doing all the spoilers, we might as well do one more. When you get to the epilogue, the end of the game,
Right.
When when he hands over his gun and goes home, and this is something else that no one has picked up on yet. Anytime the game does a normal transition, it fades to black. Anytime Walker is hallucinating, it fades to white. That entire sequence is nothing but fading to white.
Wow.
Now I have to play this
I have
game
to go
again.
play again.
Wow, that's interesting.
I'm kind of curious about something too. Like, obviously Walker is voiced by Nolan North, who we all very much associate with a very specific character in video games. How conscious were you that his voice is immediately associated with another very popular character? And how much did you consider the possibility? Because this comes up all the time, because we like to actually, at least Tom and I have, compare Uncharted with Spec Ops, in the sense that in Uncharted you're just a happy-go-lucky dude that happens to be mowing down people and has no sense of caring whatsoever about any of it, where it's very much the opposite in Spec Ops, and yet it's still the same voice actor. Was there at any point a conversation about how the character in Spec Ops was very much a very different, it's the antithesis of Nathan Drake, perhaps?
Well, to be honest, we cast Nolan way back in the process. Uncharted 2 didn't even exist as a game when Nolan was cast in Spec Ops. We brought him in to do just scratch VO when we were doing an internal vertical slice for the game. And we, really enjoyed working with him, and we really liked, what he was doing with Walker in the vertical slice. And as we didn't want to necessarily replace him, because people were beginning to, as more and more games came out with Nolan in them, and people were beginning to really see what he was, how prolific he was. We didn't want to replace him, because the thing is, Nolan is, the reason he's in so many games is because, one, he's a fantastic actor, an amazing person to work with, and he comes in and just he'll give you 3 different takes, and will instinctively know if those 3 different tries warrant it, and will, before you can even say anything, be like, let me give it another try, and he'll usually knock it right out in 2 more tries. Like, he just is so comfortable in a recording booth, and has such a range that I think people are just now really starting to see, when they find out that he played the Penguin in Arkham Asylum, that he has many, many voices that he can do, and we didn't really have to discuss with him what the character was, because so much of it was on the page. And this is partially, I know there's not really a standard writing format in games. I have more of a screenwriter background before I got into games, so I tend to write my scripts in standard screen format. So there's a lot of description and stuff within the script. So when my actors get it, they can read through a script and it's going to tell them pretty much everything they need to know about the character in the scene. And so we really didn't have to have too much discussion with Nolan. Like, he read the script and he got it, and he came in and just knocked it out of the park. Now, one of the reasons that as you get towards the end of the game and he's really sounding ragged, one of the things that we did that helped us out a lot is that, one, whenever we recorded the squad, we recorded them simultaneously. So they're all in the room together playing off of each other. We're not having them try and act to a line that we're playing into their earphones because, Adams was in the studio the week before. They're all in there, and they're playing off each other, and they're playing off the emotions of each other. And also, anytime we recorded, we started at the beginning in the game, and we recorded the entire script in chronological order. So at the end of the game, when they are really ragged and tired and angry, it's because I've had them screaming for 5 days, and they are ragged and tired and angry, and they want to go home. And so, there was a lot of just natural, of that kind of coming into it. But, a lot of, Nolan was never specifically cast to be a statement against what the type that Nolan North character that we've come to expect, because frankly he was just cast much, much earlier in the process. But I think it shows how much of a range and talent that Nolan has, that even despite that, he brought such an interesting take to the character that's different from what other people expect from him.
And it's funny because when I first started playing, my first instinct when I hear the voice is, oh, it's Nolan North. And by the time I got to the end, I was never conscious of it anymore.
I didn't notice it was Nolan North until I was halfway through and someone
really?
pointed it out. He was Walker. Like he's like you said, he's good. And
Yeah,
I
he is
actually
really
didn't
good.
pick up on that.
He's definitely one of the best.
I actually had another question going back to something you said. You talked about how this is, Spec Ops is an alternative to Call of Duty, which made it seem like it might be a new franchise. But how the heck do you make a sequel to something like this? Like, because it's all about war and war games and the way we consume war, and it's like, I don't know, you can do that again. What?
I actually agree with you. It's definitely it's been written in such a way to where you could not do a direct sequel. I'm sure if someone absolutely wanted to do a direct sequel, I'm sure someone could come in and come up with an idea. But I always saw it as a very self-contained story, that this was simply this one experience that you were going through with these characters. That we would never go back to a sand-covered Dubai. We would not follow Walker on his next mission or something like that. And I think that really the best way that you would go about with Spec Ops as a franchise to continue it is similar in ways to what Final Fantasy has done, where it's more of a thematic franchise with a few, obviously you have certain names and races and things that come up in every one, which we wouldn't really do with Spec Ops because it doesn't take place in a world with Mughals. But
what if it did?
BioShock. The new BioShock is, I think, another good example of doing a thematic sequel, dealing with things and characters. For Spec Ops, I think I've certainly put the thought into what a sequel would be. I don't know that you would want to focus on the horrors of war, because if you're doing a sequel based on that, then you're just becoming exploitive. You were trying to sell a game entirely off of the theme that, well, this is the franchise where you do incredibly messed up things. And that goes against everything that we were looking to do with Spec Ops, which was make you begin to think about them, not simply go to it because you want to play the game that makes you feel that. You would have to. It would be more about finding a deeper narrative of what the characters in your situation were going through. I think with a sequel, I think it would be a good decision to flip it around. Instead of seeing it from the hero's point of view, tell a story that's a survivor's story. What happens to soldiers maybe that are on the opposite side of a situation like this, and how are they trying to deal with it and get out of it, versus someone walking into it and turning people into enemies and plowing their way through this situation. That's not to say that any of what I just said is indicative of there being a sequel or plans for a sequel, obviously. But, I've been working on this project for many years. You put a lot of thought into things like that. And it's tricky. I don't know exactly what you would do, but there are ideas out there. I don't even know that necessarily I would be the person to do it in regards to writing it. With Spec Ops, I personally feel like I said everything as a writer that I have to say about that particular genre of game. And I could see maybe possibly revisiting it years down the line, where I have, more life experience and I've seen more things and have more wisdom to me and maybe have something else to say about it. But coming directly off of it, I feel like we said quite a lot with Spec Ops, and there's really no point in repeating it.
So you've got, I guess one last question before we'll wrap up. But you've got this shooter that defies, sort of expectations. So why give it a generic shooter name? That's a question from Brendan Sinclair.
And the box arts.
Yeah.
Ultimately, when it comes to the name, this is, like I said at the beginning, we were given a box to play in, and that box was third-person squad-based military shooter set in Dubai. that box existed because there was a box that was given to someone else, and that box is, we own the Spec Ops franchise, and we need to do something with it. So make a Spec Ops game, and someone said squad-based military shooter set in Dubai, and then that comes to us. Yeah. Make a Spec Ops game, squad-based military shooter set in Dubai. Yes. You know, you work within the box that you were given. You know, you are making, ultimately, when you're making a game, you're getting to play with someone else's money, and you have to work within certain confines that they give you. The original crux of the project was, we have this IP, we need to do something with it. And I think it's not a situation where you look at it and say, well, they made such a different game, why? I can't believe that they put such a generic name on it. I think it's actually a much better situation to look at. A company had this established IP they wanted to do, and they gave the creative team the freedom to do whatever they wanted with it and to really try something different rather than say, well, Spec Ops has always been this, we want to do that, but for a new generation of consoles. Spec Ops, if people now look at that Spec Ops name in a completely different way and take that franchise as being something more than it used to be, then generic name or not, I think it's, that's quite an achievement for creative freedom in the development and publishing process.
Well, Walt, thanks so much for joining us. It's shed a lot of light on Spec Ops: The Line, which is still fresh in our minds, and you've given us even more to ponder over that I hadn't even considered before. Now I'm going to go back and play just to notice those, subtleties.
I was trying to think of a question. I couldn't think of a question for this statement, but as soon as I beat the game, I read Heart of Darkness and I watched Apocalypse Now. And I honestly think Spec Ops Line is the best storytelling of those three.
Spec Ops Line?
Which kind of shocked me because I've never compared a game to a movie or book directly, and the game came out on top. So I needed to say that without a question attached to it, I guess.
Wow, thank you. That's now I don't have anything to respond to. Thank you. You've got me blushing over here.
Yeah. But I guess that'll bring us to a close.
Yeah.
But Walt, thanks so much for joining us at GameSpot. And obviously thanks to Tom McShay and Jeff Gershman for coming up and talking.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for having me, guys. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sorry. I just like now I want to go back and just see that stuff from a different point of view. So that's exciting. But thanks so much to you guys. Thanks so much to GameSpot listeners. And we'll see you next week for another regular episode of GameSpot Gameplay. So thanks.